This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 192 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with social psychologist and weight stigma researcher Jeffrey Hunger, which is really a great name for someone in his line of work. We discuss why we can't fight weight stigma while also advocating for weight loss, how quote-unquote wellness has been co-opted by diet culture, aka what I call the wellness diet, why we need to do more than just tell people diets don't work, the role of critical thinking in taking down diet culture, how weight stigma shows up in the gay male community, and so much more. It's a really great episode. We cover a lot of ground, and I can't wait to share it with you in just a moment. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Erica Brockway, who writes, I became vegan for ethical reasons 3 years ago, but as someone with a general interest in health and a past of restrictive eating, it quickly became more health and weight loss motivated. There's a subcategory of vegans and plant-based doctors online who promote a very low-fat diet and focus on eating quote-unquote whole, unprocessed foods while strictly avoiding oil. I became so invested in this way of eating and really believed that if I followed it, I would avoid all disease and live a long, healthy life while being slim. I believed that cravings would vanish if I stuck to this way of eating long enough because that's what I was told. Long story short, that didn't happen. I eventually was not able to mentally sustain this diet and ended up eating lots of calorie-dense foods, especially peanut butter and anything sugary. I should also add that I have become anemic and have an addiction to coffee, so I feel tired a lot and very drawn to sugar. I've been listening to your podcast and loving it, and I now realize that it is okay to have treats, but I seriously eat so much sugar, and I genuinely miss the days when I wasn't so drawn to sugar. It's like I can tell my body wants a balanced meal, but a lot of times I just crave sugar and processed foods. I want to be intuitive, but I don't trust that my intuition is really telling me what my body needs anymore. So thanks, Erica, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So first of all, I just want to underline that that was a really restrictive diet that you were on. So I really empathize with you for feeling like you can't sustain it. And of course, you were deprived eating that way. Of course, you were bound to react and not be able to stick with it. And this is really an example of what I call the wellness diet, which pretends to be about health and wellness, but is actually just another sneakier form of diet culture for the modern age. The wellness diet really has a lot of sneaky diet language that it uses, and there's lots of examples that I could give of like sneaky diet culture phrases that the wellness diet has made popular. But one of the phrases that you mentioned that really jumps out at me is that quote unquote cravings would vanish. And that phrase really shows that this diet is demonizing cravings. And of course, it's cravings specifically for foods that are demonized, right? So one of the hallmarks of diet culture in general is that it demonizes some foods while elevating others. And that's very much a central feature of this new guise of diet culture that I call the wellness diet. So the weight stigma aspect of diet culture may be de-emphasized in some of the iterations of the wellness diet that we see today, although weight stigma is always subtly present in the wellness diet, as I discuss in my interview with Jeff Hunger, which you'll hear shortly. But the moralization of food and the demonization of certain foods while elevating others is really front and center in the wellness diet, and that's one of its big tells. So I think it's interesting that you're not trusting your intuition telling you what your body needs, because it's telling you to eat certain things like sugar and processed foods. And so you're mistrusting that. And of course, the wellness diet deems those foods quote unquote bad. But I bet if you were craving foods that the wellness diet deemed quote unquote good, you wouldn't be second guessing your intuition like this. And that's another hallmark of the wellness diet, is that it makes us question ourselves and second guess ourselves when we want things that are not diet approved. But the reality is that our bodies are very good at getting what they need. They're very good at surviving. They evolved over millennia to be able to survive famines. And these cravings that you're having are so understandable given the restriction and deprivation that you went through on this diet. So research really shows that when people are deprived of food overall, when they don't have enough food overall, they really end up gravitating towards carbohydrates in particular, including sweets. Sugar is a form of carbohydrate, because these are the quickest sources of energy for the body. They break down the quickest in the bloodstream, give you that, shot of blood sugar that you absolutely need in order to not starve and in order to get things done and have energy. And that's super important when you're in a famine, which is really what diets are. So the third edition of the book, Intuitive Eating, goes into this a little more. It has a discussion of the science behind this for anyone who's interested. But just a trigger warning for that book, I would definitely recommend the third edition as opposed to earlier editions. But even the third edition has some lingering diet culture moments in it. The author's newer book, the Intuitive Eating Workbook, is much better on that front, although I don't know if it has the discussion of carbohydrate cravings in there. But they have a forthcoming fourth edition of the main Intuitive Eating book that I'm assuming will still have that discussion and will also likely be pretty diet culture free at this point, because I know that's one of their main goals in revising the book. So the science behind carbohydrate cravings is really there, showing us that when people are starved, when people are deprived, as in a famine, aka a diet, they really gravitate preferentially towards foods that are high in carbohydrate, high in sugar. And really, it's no coincidence that people's quote unquote binge foods tend to be carbohydrate rich. And on diets, we're also drawn to energy-dense foods that have more fat in them, which is another important way that our bodies keep us alive in times of famine. They seek out these energy-dense foods and help us maintain energy in a situation of scarcity. So it only makes sense that you'd be drawn to more quote-unquote processed foods right now, and calorie-dense foods. Like you said, I prefer to use the term energy-dense because the word calorie, while it really just describes a unit of energy, it's so loaded with diet culture baggage that it can be triggering. So I just like to say energy to remind us all that that's what is in food. It's just energy, and that's good. And so driving you towards these energy-dense foods is another way that your body is helping you survive the famine. So, again, you've been restricting food in general, and you've also been restricting these foods in particular. And so having the sort of response where you're driven preferentially towards these foods now makes a whole lot of sense in the context of your body doing what it needs to do and keeping you alive. So when you find yourself eating more of these foods, I don't want you to beat yourself up about it. I would love to have you reframe your thinking so that you're not thinking there's something wrong with you anymore, the way that the wellness diet wants you to believe, but reframe it to say that, this is just your body doing its job to keep you safe. And it's responding to diets the only way it knows how, and the reason that we're here today is because millennia ago, our ancestors evolved to have this process, this way of responding to famine. And so we survived as a species. And I know it sounds like you're really craving more balance in your eating, or you're worried that you're not eating quote unquote in balance. But the reality is that balance really happens over time. Balance in eating is not something that happens on a meal to meal basis or even necessarily a day-to-day basis. It doesn't mean that you're always eating quote unquote perfectly balanced meals, right? For you, given that you swung so far in the direction of restriction, it's completely understandable that you would now be swinging the other way and that you'd be eating lots of the things you were so deprived of and just trying to make up for that restriction. And that's really what I call the restriction pendulum, which is when you swing from restriction to eating a lot of food. And it's a really natural and equal and opposite reaction, right? In physics, we all know, even if we didn't take physics in high school, we all know that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? And when you swing a pendulum, that's the most obvious example of that, because the energy that it takes to swing it over to one side gets expended, or you get the same force swinging it over to the other side. And there's also this phenomenon that I call the honeymoon phase, which is basically the same thing in regard to eating the certain types of foods that were formerly off limits. So the restriction pendulum is really when you're not eating enough food overall and you're restricting your food intake, you're not getting enough, you're swinging back to eating all of the food, to eating lots of food and having a real abundance of food because you were so restricted. The honeymoon phase is when you were swinging over to the side of deprivation of specific kinds of foods, and now you swing over to the other side of wanting to eat those particular foods all the time. And actually having a honeymoon phase or having a pendulum swinging back from restriction phase really is your body's way of finding balance after deprivation, after the restriction of diets, and that is balance. So of course, eventually you'll move into a place where you feel like your eating is more balanced in any given day as well, where you're not drawn exclusively to those foods that were formerly off limits, and where you have more variety because you trust that you're allowed to eat whatever you want whenever you want it. And so you can truly listen to what you actually want in that moment without this sort of fear of things being taken away again, or this reaction against deprivation, because you won't be deprived anymore. But it's important to know that even when you find that place of equilibrium after recovering from diet culture, which takes time, so don't expect that to happen overnight, but when you do find that place of equilibrium, you're still going to eat some quote unquote processed foods and some sweets and some other foods every day probably. And that's part of your body being in balance. That's part of what balance looks like in life beyond dieting. Because recovery from diet culture doesn't mean that you only eat quote unquote unprocessed, quote unquote whole, quote unquote clean foods and never crave sweets. That's the myth that diet culture sells us of what it looks like when we're not dieting, but that's just not true. That's not how intuitive eaters eat. We intuitive eaters really have those foods in addition to the fun foods and the things that diet culture demonizes, and don't judge or make anything off limits. So really in an intuitive and peaceful relationship with food, we're eating processed foods, we're eating sweets, we're eating fun foods, and we're also eating some whole foods, quote unquote, some plant-based, quote unquote foods, some foods that diet culture deems, quote unquote, healthy. And we're not discriminating against either of those types of foods. So nothing is off limits. We're just going based on what we feel like eating, what our taste, is guiding us towards, and eventually some potential attention to nutrition. But that's the last principle of intuitive eating for a reason. And we have to get over diet culture before we can even think about any nutritional considerations we might want to bring into our relationship with food without having that turn into another diet. The other thing I want to point out here is that while it's absolutely possible to be vegan for ethical reasons alone and not for quote unquote health or weight loss, it's extremely hard to do that while living in diet culture. And for anyone who is recovering from disordered eating right now or has a history of it, I'd really think twice about embarking on a restrictive style of eating like veganism while you're recovering. There are exceptions to that, of course, but they're very rare in my experience. Those exceptions are very rare. It's really the people who started eating vegan exclusively for very deeply held, long-standing animal rights beliefs and without having diet culture anywhere in the mix who are able to do this while recovering. And that's often people who are like punk rock vegans or older hippie vegans, people who have this sort of culture around their decision for being vegan that doesn't have anything to do with the world of quote unquote plant-based eating on the internet or Instagram, because people who discovered veganism through those worlds are very susceptible to disordered eating. That world of so-called plant-based eating is very deeply tied to diet culture and its new guise as the wellness diet. And so generally it's not helpful for anyone who's trying to recover from diet culture. There's a blogger and Instagram personality whom some of you may have heard of who used to go by the name of Plant-Based Pixie, and she used to post a lot of really problematic wellness diety stuff, but then she started exploring and moving into the anti-diet space because she realized she had her own disordered relationship with food, and she somewhat recently, a few months ago, changed her name to remove the term plant-based from her brand because she realized how harmful that was. And she's from the UK, and she put it in this wonderfully British way that I just love when she said, "I was a wellness wanker when I created that name." And she said that basically the term plant-based no longer accurately reflects what she does and what she's about, because now she's about debunking a lot of the wellness woo and the nutribolics, as I think she calls it, and some of the other UK bloggers call it, that is so prominent in the wellness diet world. So for Erica, who asked the question, I would really recommend unplugging yourself from that plant-based community that you are a part of and just working to make peace with all foods and heal your relationship with food outside of that community that can be so harmful and so disordered. And eventually, once you've been solidly in recovery for a good long time, like probably a few years at least, and you're no longer moralizing about food or using any disordered behaviors or pursuing weight loss, then maybe you can see if you want to revisit any changes in your eating for animal rights reasons and do it without the influence of the wellness diet and that harmful, quote unquote, plant-based community that you are a part of. But that said, you might find that making those changes in your eating is always triggering to your recovery, in which case there are tons of other things you can do to work towards animal welfare that don't involve jeopardizing your recovery, like volunteering at an animal shelter or donating money to animal rights causes or fostering rescue animals or lots of different things. Because remember that you are an animal too. And you have the right to a peaceful relationship with food and a life free from disordered eating. And those things are important, and you are your number one charge in this world. You are your number one responsibility. And so take care of yourself and do what you need to do to make sure that you don't fall back into this disordered place with food, because that is ultimately more harmful to your overall health. And so in that sense, it's really going against whatever health rationale you might have for doing the quote unquote plant-based thing as well. So I hope that helps. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it much more quickly than I can do here, come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. When you sign up, not only do you get a wealth of audio and written content teaching you the principles of intuitive eating, but you also get an exclusive monthly Q&A podcast where you can ask your own questions and listen to hundreds of answers I've given to other people already so that you can work through the sticking points in intuitive eating and really put it into practice in your own life. You'll also get access to our private Facebook group exclusively for course participants so that you can have real-time guidance from me and my team, as well as hundreds of other great people who are on this intuitive eating journey. One of those is a participant named Samantha Brown, who recently shared this on her public Facebook page in a post about resources to learn more about body positivity. She said, "A word on books about intuitive eating. I don't recommend them because intuitive eating has morphed too much into the realm of the wellness diet. I do practice intuitive eating and it has changed and healed my life, but I did it through Christy Harrison's Intuitive Eating Fundamentals online course. All of my other recommendations are free with internet access or library membership, but this is the one paid program I recommend because it is that good. And you get lifetime access to her ever-evolving materials." So I love getting feedback like that about the course, and it really is ever evolving because, as I've mentioned before on the podcast, I'm getting ready to release a big update to the course materials in just about a month, since I've now been teaching this course for 3 years. So now is a great time to join because you'll get all the content that people are loving now, plus free access to all the updates as soon as they're released. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by Poshmark. Instead of buying new things, you can shop from millions of closets across America with Poshmark. I got a bunch of new winter clothes on Poshmark this year, and I liked them so much that I basically ignored all my other clothes for the entire season, even though I paid a lot more for the other clothes. You can download the free Poshmark app today and shop from tons of brands for all ages and genders, with a wide range of plus sizes available too. Poshmark is the easiest way to buy and sell fashion items, and shipping is easy for both the seller and buyer because items ship super fast. When you see something you want, you can make the seller an offer so that you can get the stuff at a price that works for you. And if you're doing a much-needed closet clean-out, listing your items on Poshmark is easy. Just upload the pictures of your stuff to the app, set a price, and then ship it. No more cluttering your closet with stuff you no longer wear. I've been really amazed at some of the awesome plus size and size inclusive brands that I've seen on Poshmark, like Torrid, Eloquii, Premi, Universal Standard, ModCloth, and lots more. I found a pair of Madewell jeans for just $40 and an amazing ASOS jumpsuit for just $30. You can get $5 off your first purchase just for listening to Food Psych. Download the Poshmark app and enter the invite code FoodPsych when you sign up. That's invite code FOODPSYCH for $5 off your first purchase. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Jeffrey Hunger. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
Growing up, food was an important part of our family life. I came from a strong, interdependent lower middle class family. And so coming together around the dinner table for family meals was a huge part of my upbringing. This was, time to check in and my mom's favorite time to talk about our best and worst things that happened that day. And so food was always present at, family gatherings, at social gatherings, and always around the house. And it was sort of the central piece to keeping sort of a cohesive family unit.
That sounds nice. So it sounds like it was a pretty not fraught, but, very low key sort of relationship with food that you had.
Yeah, I think from a very early age, my mom was strong, was really interested in making sure that we were eating balanced, were trying fruits and vegetables as much as we wanted to without really imposing a lot of external rules or social pressures, which I think is great. She, the house was always stocked with her classic trio of apples, oranges, and bananas. But, we were also a lower middle class family. And so oftentimes our food at the table reflected that. We were a meat and potatoes and canned veggies family when it came to dinner.
Yeah. So it wasn't the sort of like long labor intensive types of meals or farmer's market, like the stuff that you see today with kind of the wellness world.
Oh, no, absolutely not. For one, my mom worked outside of the house. And so oftentimes meals for her were structured around something that she could either throw on in the morning, talking crockpot Tuesdays, or meals like that would not only work for dinner, but would be in the fridge for breakfast, lunch, dinner over the next couple of days. I was always geared towards what can we do that's going to feed the family for more than just that one meal? Because, she was out of the house providing for us, and she wasn't there to, like you say, walk to the farmer's market and prepare this long 3-course meal. And actually, I don't even think the tiny town that I grew up in would have even had a farmer's market then. I grew up in fairly rural Minnesota. So when I was growing up there, the city was maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people. Which is funny because it was only about an hour and 10 minutes outside of, the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro. But the second you get about 45 minutes out, it's quickly pretty rural and quickly pretty small. And so there weren't really an abundance of things like farmers market or fresh fruit stands.
Right. And that's so interesting. I think the sort of like class dynamics of how people are conditioned to want to eat today, the like Michael Pollan sort of quote unquote whole food or real food movement is so prohibitive for so many people because, again, it's so labor intensive. You have to spend hours cooking from scratch and just going and getting the ingredients and sometimes going to different places to get the ingredients. And, who has time for that when both parents are working and trying to feed a family?
Absolutely. Even something as simple as roasting vegetables. That is, if you want to roast fresh vegetables, imagine roasting carrots. Peeling, chopping, and roasting is a 45-minute process. Mm-hmm. So if you get home at 5:30 or 6 o'clock at night, that means at earliest 6:45 or 7 o'clock is when dinner can get on the table. And so, yeah, it can be prohibitive for folks that are, commuting a long way or are working outside of the house to come home and then labor another 45 minutes or an hour to get these sort of farm fresh foods and plates that Pollan and others kind of talk about.
And like, that's just the side dish too. Like the carrots are like one component that's not, it's like multiply that by like 3 or 4 for each component of the meal. And that's, very prohibitive. You have to have someone who's probably home most of the day to be able to do that.
Yeah. And imagine if you have a family of 5 or a family of 6 that you're trying to feed too. Even one round of roasting vegetables isn't going to give you leftovers. It's going to, that's going to be all of that work just for that one side dish for that meal. And so I'm not terribly surprised that oftentimes our side vegetables were, canned green beans, canned peas, which were the one canned vegetable that I could not do growing up. But it's not surprising to me, like looking back, 20 years later, that with all of the time constraints that, of course, my mom wasn't going to start cooking at 6 o'clock when she got home.
Right. It makes total sense. And especially needing to have the leftovers too. You can't just make the meal for that night and have it be so labor intensive. It also has to stretch to following days.
Exactly. It's, make 12 pork chops. One of her famous dishes was this roasted pork chop dish. And so for the family of 4 or 5, she would make 12 or 14 pork chops because then look, we've got meat for the next 3 or 4 days cooked up.
Yeah, that's so smart.
Yeah, oh yeah, she's a whiz, and she's actually always been in the food industry. And so I feel like food has always been a part of my life in one way or another, because starting from the earliest ages, she was working at one meat or food company or another. And, 40 years later is still in that industry.
Wow, that's interesting. And it sounds like the sort of love of food and the idea that food was something you could bond over and be communal about, and that it also fed you and fueled you, was very much a part of her relationship with food that she passed down to you, but not any of the stuff of like, it has to be perfect or it has to be quote unquote healthy in a certain way, or like a sort of rarefied way or anything like that.
Yeah, it never, food from my mom never came with external rules or guidelines about, what was or was not appropriate, or what was or wasn't healthy for that matter. She enjoyed a chocolate chip cookie now and again, and would, make homemade chocolate chip cookies on the weekend. She was never one to exclude anything from the household, which I think, growing up, it wasn't something that you really were able to, obviously I wasn't a researcher when I was 6. And so, looking back on it now, I think she really set a really great foundation for myself and my siblings to have a really healthy relationship with food and have a really healthy relationship with the eating process, because eating is not just personal, it's social, it's communal. Like you say, it's this place to come together. And I think in particular for middle class and lower class families who tend to be more interdependent, these are interdependent family structures, it becomes this central point of reconnection after a long day or after a few days on the road. And I really loved that aspect of it and have tried to carry that with me since then.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I think that's another thing about like, when you think about the current proselytizing about food that goes on, and this idea of like the quote unquote obesity epidemic, and we need to, stop it by stopping people eating quote unquote unhealthy foods. It really is taking away that connectedness and that bonding over food and that like simple, uncomplicated thing that food can be to help people come together and just like facilitate catching up and being together and having an experience that is communal.
Yeah, and it can be fun. I learned from both of my parents very early on that, cooking can be really fun and really important. And so whenever I could, I would try to cook with my mom, or on the weekends cook with my dad. And I actually probably learned more about cooking from my dad than I did from my mom. He was big in his like soups, stews, and chilies. It was those foods that he could make on a Sunday that would last him at least a week. And he could easily pack it for work, and he was fine, eating chili or stew for, lunch every day for an entire week.
Yeah, that's very smart. That's a good way to stretch the labor too.
Yeah, and he was just as busy and working outside the house. But it was nice to see that on the weekends they would take that time to stay connected to their food, because I think the time pressure can very easily get people to see eating in like a little bit more of a transactional, like just calories need energy sort of perspective. And for me, that pains me, because I get a lot of joy and a lot of happiness out of cooking and eating and sort of relating to other people around food.
I feel the same way now. I mean, it wasn't always that way. I definitely had my ups and downs with my relationship with food, but I had a similar sort of family structure of like the family meals were a time when we came together and bonded and talked about our day. And it was really something that I think we all looked forward to. So to have that be sometimes participatory and fun too. Like my sister and I would sometimes help with the cooking, or we'd do like Taco Tuesday with, a bunch of different things, and we could like make our own tacos or make our own pizzas or whatever. That was really fun.
The interactive meals like that are always so much fun. Like either Taco Tuesdays was pretty big in our family as well. It was either Taco Tuesdays or Crockpot Tuesdays, depending on what my mom had going on. But once I met my partner, his family, one of their big traditions was make your own pizzas on Fridays. They would get together at the end of the school week, him and his 3 younger siblings with their parents, and each get a dough, and the parents would put out just this awesome array of pizza toppings. And it was so much fun. And, everybody makes their own kind of flavor profile that they want, and then you can swap and share. And that was actually one of our earliest dates was with his family over this pizza night. And so it's sort of has held a special place in my heart since then.
Yeah, that sounds so sweet and really fun. Like a nice way to be with his whole family. And probably if it was an early date too, it's like that's an important time to be interacting with the whole family.
It was embarrassingly like our second date.
Wow, you moved fast.
We had our first date, and then on our second date, I met his family. And on our third date, I think I went to Easter with the entire family. It was a quick progression that I love to jokingly remind him of. That he, our third date, I had met his entire extended family over Easter.
Oh my God, that's so funny. Well, when you know. It's just like, yeah. Gotta do it.
8 years later, we're married, so.
Yay. That's awesome. Well, so yeah, let's go back to sort of childhood and how you got from there to where you are now. Because I'm so curious, it sounds like you had a really great relationship with food as a young child. And did it evolve or change as you went through like adolescence, which is often a fraught time for people with food?
Yeah, I think for me, the relationship was still fairly healthy. During adolescence, I was a heavier kid growing up, particularly before this huge growth spurt that I had in high school. I think I started high school around 5 feet tall and finished closer to what I am right now, which is 6'1". And so, that came with a lot of body-related self-consciousness for sure. But knowing all that I do now about weight-related teasing among kids, I can sort of reflect back onto my own childhood and see that I had a fairly positive social experiences overall, thankfully. I had a great friend group, good classmates, supportive teachers and family members. And I think that sort of solid social network really helped keep any of this body-related self-consciousness from worsening and, morphing into more unhealthy forms of weight control at that time.
Yeah. So it sounds like you didn't have other people saying something was wrong with your weight, even if you felt like maybe you were a little self-conscious.
Yeah, it was at that time. It was a little more self-directed, and thankfully it was not because you and I both know the data on how frequently higher body weight kids are targets of teasing and discrimination, and it can do incredible psychological and physical harm. And so it was thankfully not a common experience for me growing up. I will say once I was a little older, probably getting into my late teens, early 20s, guilt and body image started to play a bigger role in eating behavior. I had, just come out as gay, which was fantastic and a huge weight off my shoulders. But at the same time, I became increasingly exposed to the norms and thinness pressures that are unfortunately really potent in much of the gay male community. And that, I think, was probably the first time in which body image and these feelings started to manifest in things like dieting, and starting to diet for weight loss or diet for quote unquote health when we knew it was nothing but.
Yeah, nothing but external looks based stuff.
Exactly. It was looks based or social pressure based, and all of the reasons we know are strong drivers of maladaptive eating behavior and dieting behavior, and just like diet culture and weight loss or body-related culture is incredibly strong in the gay male community, and still is today, unfortunately. This is a thing a lot of younger queer men deal with in their day-to-day lives, because if we think about how they are socialized in, not only the expectations to the dominant culture of the thin ideal and sort of these thinness pressures, but how heightened they are and how sort of tied they are to whether or not you are, viable as a partner within the queer community becomes a really salient concern. And I think a really strong driver of a lot of these maladaptive eating behaviors among queer kids.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. I mean, the pressure that it's like you have to be thin to be lovable, basically. Thinness holds such a high value, and almost more so, I think, than in certain straight communities, even because, I think in certain straight communities, there's a little more, at least, like men accepting a variety of different body types, and of course, individual men maybe having more strict preferences for thinness. But there's, we've seen the research, right, that straight men don't actually prefer women to be as thin as women prefer themselves to be. And so maybe there's a little more flexibility there. But I don't know what the research says or what your experience has been in the gay community of like, why is there such pressure? Why do you think it's so seen as being so important to be thin in order to find love or to find partnership?
It's a tough question because I don't think we have a ton of great data on this from an academic perspective. And it's something that I would love to and sort of plan to delve into once I start my job this fall. I'm going to start working more with LGBT populations and queer men in particular, and diving into eating and body image related issues with that community. But it's hard to say because, like you said, it's almost like the level of thinness pressures are on par with, if not higher than we would see among straight women. They're certainly higher than they are among, straight men. And they seem to be matching these levels that we traditionally would be seeing among, younger straight women. And I don't know if this is perhaps a response to staying connected to some dominant society when you are otherwise othered. You can imagine like this being some sort of misplaced response to the stigmatization that the LGBT community faces. Is perhaps one response is to reify and hold closer these dominant ideologies that we know are important to the broader culture. I will say this is incredibly speculative, but it's interesting to think about because we don't really know, but we do see that for the most part, these thinness pressures are widespread throughout the queer community and seem to be particularly damaging. There are subgroups within the gay male community that are much more willing to have a flexible sense of what is attractive when it comes to body types and body diversity. And we have seen it grow, and we've seen sort of a body positivity movements, a little bit of a groundswell, but it's still sort of a niche movement within at least the gay male or queer male community.
Right. I mean, I will say even like in terms of the guests I've had on the show who are people that are experts in studying this stuff and doing either like research or helping people on the ground, like I think you're one of maybe a very small handful, I can't even remember, of gay men who've been on the show versus, most of the people in this field are really like straight cis women and increasingly, more non-binary folks as well. But definitely very few people that I know of who are doing this kind of work in the world that are like out gay men.
Yeah, it's a very small, I think, sort of pocket of researchers, that are gay men themselves that are interested in studying how these, how stigma and related processes unfold among that community. And like you say, I can only think of a handful of other researchers that would sort of fit that demographic and fit that research expertise. It's great to see that there's other people committed to it, though. I'm excited to, eventually, right now I would not consider myself an expert in that area, but eventually hope to be considered amongst their ranks because I think it's a really important topic to bring sort of the social, psychological, and stigma-related lens to. Because we know there are huge, huge health disparities, particularly in, things like unhealthy weight control behaviors between heterosexual and non-heterosexual individuals. Figuring out what the particular drivers of these things or, perhaps barriers to treatment is going to be incredibly important moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting question that doesn't seem to have much research behind it yet. So it's cool that you're interested in moving into this space. Much needed. How did that unfold for you then when you started dieting and sort of fell into those pressures when you first came out or when you were in your early 20s? Like where did it go from there?
Thankfully, it didn't go past just dieting. I was, I would say for a couple years, I was a fairly consistent dieter, just like every other dieter, rotating through, whether it is low carb or low calorie or certain ratios or certain special programs, and trying them all, to varying degrees of quote unquote what I thought was success at the time. And always to lose whatever that success was, and then find myself on a different diet or a quote unquote different lifestyle, because that's the lovely way that the diet companies and these diet advocates have loved to rebrand themselves. Not naming any large corporations or anything.
Right.
Just not naming names, but there's always that new lens of lifestyles. And so, yeah, I'd say for us a good couple years, I rotated through different diets. And then my junior year of college, I ended up becoming Tracy Mann's lab manager.
Oh, wow.
And I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with Dr. Mann's work, basically showing and advocating for how ineffective diets are in the long run and how we should just basically never be dieting. And working with Tracy and reading Tracy's research really, really opened my eyes. By then, I knew I was committed to going to graduate school. I knew I wanted to, be a social psychologist, but I hadn't really considered a different lens on thinking about eating and thinking about health until I met Tracy.
You kind of stumbled into her just because of the social psychology interest that you already had, but it wasn't like you came to her lab because you were interested in that particular line of research. It was just the lab position was open.
Yeah, to be honest with you, she heard me complaining on the hall about my current job, which at the time I was a cook. I cooked in a deli, a grocery store deli, for a few years in college, which was great for getting to learn how to become a better cook, but wasn't a super fun job as a 20-year-old. And Tracy overheard me complaining one day and basically asked me if I wanted to be her lab manager.
Wow.
And I found out years later, because Tracy and I are still very good friends, that she had been vetting me for weeks before that. But she heard the appropriate point of entry when I was particularly annoyed with work and complaining loudly on the floor a few offices down from her. And she really, really changed my perspective on health and eating, and really shaped fundamentally where I ended up going with my research, to be honest.
That's incredible. And I'm sure probably also the way that you started relating to your own body and knowing that diets don't work the way that her research really shows is probably dissuasive for you.
100%. And I think that research is a really fantastic entry point into, if diets don't work, then what perspective should we be taking? If the dominant ideology is diet culture, and I've just stumbled across this fantastic research saying pretty definitively that diets don't work in the long run, what perspective should I be adopting? And I think it was also around this time where I started to read some of Linda Bacon's early work. This might have been right around the time, I'll have to check my dates, it's been a while, but right around the time when her first Health at Every Size book was published. And it was really this sort of confluence of a few different things that the dominant ideology had just been completely undercut by reading Tracy's work. And then Dr. Bacon's work was just right there and had this immediately useful alternative framework, an alternative lens to really how we think about health and weight. And it was incredibly transformative.
Yeah. And how lucky that you sort of stumbled into Dr. Bacon's work then too, when it was like, okay, now what? What do I do with this?
Yeah, because you can imagine that if we just tell people that the dominant ideology, that this diet culture does not work, and don't say anything beyond that, all we're left with are a bunch of people that are confused and hopeless. And that is not the goal at all of an anti-diet or a non-diet approach. That is just step one, is let's just reconcile, what you think we know or what we think we know with the data. And it is that in the long run, I don't have not to harp on this, but in the long run, we know diets don't work. And so it's once that is accepted, which, we know can be challenging in and of itself. But once we get that notion accepted, then it's how do we scaffold up a different type of relationship and get it to a different type of culture, with respect to how we relate to food and our bodies and our self-image.
Totally. And I think too, when we recognize that diets don't work and really internalize that, I think there's so many paths that open up, many of which are just leading back to diet culture and not obviously so, like the wellness path opens up and it's like, oh, I can just do wellness. I don't have to worry about weight. It's just about health and my weight will take care of itself, which magically means like, P.S. I'll lose weight, and so it circles back to diet culture. It's just this other form that I call the wellness diet, but it's so easy to sort of get seduced onto that path when you're just coming out of this awareness of like, okay, diets really don't work. I guess I can't do what I've been doing before. And so finding health at every size at that time, I think is really fortuitous because there's so many other things you could find at that moment that wouldn't be that helpful, actually.
Oh, 100%. Like you said, the wellness diet or this wellness approach is incredibly enticing because it offers up a lot of the same fundamentals that diet culture does. And so it's comfortable enough. It feels close enough to what diet culture was, but far enough away that you can convince yourself that this will work. Because if it's psychologically far enough away that you can even tell yourself that, oh no, diets don't work. I can admit that in a heartbeat. Have you seen this research? No, I'm on a wellness plan. So the wellness plan is going to work. It's going to make me healthier, which is often just used as coded language, like you say, for telling people it's going to make you lose weight. It's going to thin you out. That's what we mean when we say healthier. It's just with a wink. And we're seeing this as large corporations that were previously weight-oriented are trying to rebrand themselves as wellness-oriented while not really changing any of the underlying infrastructure. If what's under the hood doesn't change, just because you slap a different paint color on a car doesn't really change that it's not still a car.
Yeah, that's so true. And it really is like the underlying scaffolding of it is the same. But you're right that it sort of seems far enough away from what you knew and yet still familiar enough to feel like, okay, I'm safe here. Because I think that sometimes when people first come to health at every size and intuitive eating, they sort of feel unsafe because it's just like jumping without a net. It's so far afield from what they've known. And this idea that like you could just sort of not have weight be a thing that you're focusing on and not have quote unquote health in the way that it's currently packaged and sold to us in diet culture be a guiding force, but that you could do something completely different and really like trust your body and trust yourself kind of maybe feels like a bridge too far for a lot of people. So I think wellness is sometimes like that first stop. And I think a lot of people too, not enough people, but I think a fair number of the people that I've talked to on this podcast and in my coaching programs and stuff have gone down the wellness rabbit hole after realizing diets don't work and wanting to get away from diets and then been burned by that too and been like, okay, well, that didn't work either. So now what? And then eventually found their way to health at every size and intuitive eating.
And it's interesting because diet culture and, wellness culture both convince you and continue to tell you that you shouldn't be listening to your body. You should not be trusting your body. And that's why that can seem like such a leap, like you say, that you're almost leaping without a net, because for the past 10, 15, 20, 25 years, you've been fed this line that the last thing you should be trusting is your body. You should be focusing exclusively on external rules and what you can and cannot eat, how much you should or should not eat. And so we have just become so disassociated with what our body is trying to tell us one way or another, that I think that's why it's able to sort of suck so many people in that were previously, entrenched in the diet culture, is because it still gives you the rules. It still tells you what you're supposed to do because you don't know how to listen to your body or trust it. And so that's terrifying. That first step into ditching external rules for internal cues is a big one. And that's why it's helpful to have frameworks like health at every size or intuitive eating and not just leaving yourself, like I said before, at the diets don't work, now what? It's nice to have something to scaffold you on and get you a little closer to becoming in tune with your body and respecting its internal signals and its cues of hunger and fullness. But I agree with you. I think that first leap can often be the biggest barrier for people because it's terrifying.
Yeah, it is. And I think you're right that like having those sort of structures that, eventually I think people, when they're truly eating intuitively and truly practicing health at every size, long after having made that leap out of diet culture, it's going to look really different. It's probably not going to look so structured, and like, I know for myself, I came back to intuitive eating because I was born, we're all born as intuitive eaters. And then I was able to maintain that luckily until I was about 20 and then got sucked into diet culture then through losing a tiny amount of thin privilege, basically through like a tiny amount of weight gain, but was able to ultimately recover from like the decade of dieting and disordered eating I did. And now 10 years out from that recovery, I'm like, it's not the structured way that like I even teach it to people when they're first learning it. I don't have to be like, how hungry am I? Or, and even focusing on that too much, I think is sort of a part of diet culture in a way, being like, am I hungry enough to deserve to eat? That's all sort of wrapped up in like people trying to turn intuitive eating into a diet. But I think now it's like I don't even have to be like conscious of it so much. It's just like, oh, I'm hungry. Like I'm struck with this awareness that I'm hungry and then I go eat. And it's very second nature versus in the beginning, it was much more like mechanical and felt like I had to like be doing something, be practicing something.
But I think a really nice analogy to that is starting a mindfulness practice. When you're first starting out with mindfulness, it is a very, very heavily conscious of like, now I'm focusing on my breath. Now I'm tracing sensations, from the top of my head to my feet. Now I'm following my breathing, that there are very conscious, deliberative things that you have to do to get in a mindful state. But as your mindfulness practice evolves and becomes more consistent, those become much more automatic. And you are able to engage in these sort of characteristics of mindfulness in a more or less reflexive way, that they are just a function of how you operate in your day-to-day life. And I think that actually, like you say, is what intuitive eating looks like once it's become so ingrained that it becomes an automatic part of your day-to-day.
That is so true. Yeah, you sort of reflexively click into it. It's not something you have to try to do, but it is so conscious at the beginning. It is so much work at the beginning that I can see, that too kind of being a barrier for people to really going into it. It's hard work.
Yeah, it takes effort to undo the damage of diet culture. This has been damaging people for decades. And so it's not going to happen overnight, but the benefits of being on the other side, far outweigh any of the challenges that come with adopting and getting up to speed with that type of intuitive eating practice, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, same here. I mean, that's what the picture I try to paint for people too is just like, what could your life be like without this diet stuff standing in your way, without like the constant worries about what am I going to eat, or did I eat too much, or, am I going to exercise enough, blah, 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 like all of this stuff sort of sucking away your mental energy. What space would you have in your mind and in your life without that? That's kind of awesome.
Well, and you can also think about swapping even in the beginning of an intuitive eating practice when it is really cognitively a lot. Like you think about all of that energy that you said you've just been wasting on worrying, ruminating, and being concerned about your diet. All of that cognitive energy can just be transmitted to be about thinking intuitively. So if we think of it in terms of like the net cognitive effort, if you suck away all of that effort that you were formerly putting into navigating diet culture and all the shit that comes with it, you can put that cognitive effort into being mindful about your eating and really starting to gain practice at intuitively, eating food.
Yeah, that's true, because it does take so much work at first that the work, you just sort of substitute the work in one area for the work in another. And then eventually it's not work anymore. And that's like the thing that you have to look forward to with intuitive eating that you can't look forward to with dieting, because there's never that time when it's not effortful dieting.
Exactly. It's always going to be in the back of your mind if you're under the weight of diet culture. But yes, at the beginning of intuitive eating, you're going to still need to use that same level of cognitive effort. But listen, you've been doing it for 20 years. What's the harm in switching to a frame or a lens that ultimately is going to become automatic and ultimately is going to free you in a lot of ways?
Yeah, totally. It's such a liberatory lens that we can look at the world through.
Yeah.
It's so completely different. Well, I'm so curious about your transition sort of back to that, and also how you got from, I mean, I think it's a very natural transition, honestly, to kind of go from like understanding diets don't work and starting to learn about health at every size to researching weight stigma, because that, it's like that's kind of the basis of diet culture really is weight stigma. But I'm curious how you got to that point.
Yeah. So a little bit of my origin story, I suppose. When I was finishing up my undergraduate degree, I took a course on applied social psychology. And in this course, I can still remember it to this day, I read for the first time about this idea of stereotype threat. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept, but it's basically this idea that priming stigmatized groups with stereotypes can ironically make them engage in behaviors that confirm those stereotypes. So you can think of the classic example is the stereotype that women are bad at math. If you remind women of this stereotype and then give them a math test, they actually underperform compared to if you had never said anything about that stereotype. I found that fascinating. And it's this idea that stereotype, thankfully, is less pervasive nowadays. And so we don't see the gender math stereotype threat effect as often. But when I read that paper in 2008, it just immediately got me wondering why this hadn't been applied in the weight domain. Because there's all of these really nasty and really pernicious stereotypes about higher body weight individuals, especially when it comes to eating behavior. And so I was really interested in this idea of, well, if we remind or bring to mind these stereotypes, does that ironically make higher body weight individuals consume more food? And it was that idea that just launched what would eventually become the past 10 years of my career. Reading that paper, it was really interesting because it was, again, it's all about confluence of events. Before working with Tracy, I was not super interested in pursuing health when I was in graduate school. And then before reading this paper, I was not really interested in stigma and social identity threat. To be perfectly honest, before those two events happened, I wanted to study impression management and how people self-present in interpersonal relations. It was something completely unrelated to the work that I do now. And if those few little events hadn't have happened, I would not be on this conversation with you right now.
I know, that's wild.
It's crazy. It's really interesting to reflect on it, a decade later, because I finished my undergraduate degree a decade ago. And without those events happening and without those people like Tracy coming into my life, I really would not have had these ideas swirling together to say, you know what, I want to study weight stigma. I really think this is an understudied area and I really want to do it. And then in 2009, a giant review article by Rebecca Poole came out that was basically laying the groundwork for a lot of weight stigma work that needed to be done. So this paper was published in 2009, and it was sort of a state of the art, what do we know about weight stigma right now and what's really left? And I found that paper to be really inspiring because it was clearly showed that there was a lot of work to be done. But one of the things that I noticed when I read that paper was that there was a really a lack of like a really strong theoretical underpinning, Like thinking about this, at a broader level and thinking about it from how stigma exists not only within the person, but in the community and in the society, and taking a broader level to it and thinking really richly with it. And but it really, those few sort of events really sparked what would end up becoming 10 years of my life.
That's so amazing. And I think you've done so much for the field in terms of bringing it to that broader level and thinking about it in terms of social dynamics and not just what goes on with the individual. And we were talking a little bit off mic about how a lot of the weight stigma research that the early weight stigma research especially, but even still came out of this idea that weight stigma is just a barrier to weight management, quote unquote weight management. And that if you can remove the weight stigma, then you can make people more able to lose weight. And your perspective on it as someone who had some rooting in health at every size to begin with, and who was also interested in like the social lens and not just thinking about it in terms of the individual. I think that's so important that you came on the scene and started doing that. And I know there's other researchers like Janet Tomiyama, whom you've worked with, kind of with that same orientation towards it. Instead of thinking about it as like a way to help people lose weight, it's about how can we remove this injustice from society?
Yeah, and I think unfortunately, there's still a faction of weight stigma researchers who, position their work in this way, that they see weight stigma as either an impediment to weight loss or an impediment to weight maintenance. And I've come to the point now in 2019 where I see that as an incredibly problematic framing. But I'll be the first to admit, like I did off mic, is that if you look at some of my earlier research, if you look at my work from 2014, 2015, it was still wrestling with and still framed in an incredibly problematic way, because it was, it had that opening paragraph that was, the scourge of obesity. And then that second paragraph was, well, but weight stigma is really bad too. And it was because even as someone who was coming from a Hayes perspective, it was hard to shake sort of that medical model within academia. As personally as I was invested in health at every size, it was hard to still shake that every other article that I saw looked like this. And so, of course, I was a second or third year graduate student at the time, I sort of unreflexively, uncritically just adopted that approach. But, since then, I've engaged much more critically with the literature on, in fat studies and health at every size, and just really see that, that framing where it starts with obesity is bad, or it starts with weight loss or weight maintenance is good, is inherently contradictory with anti-stigma approach. You can't be anti-stigma or anti-weight stigma in one breath and advocate for weight loss in another breath. That's just inherently contradictory and is just, I think, a little short-sighted when it comes to thinking about the broader implications of the work that we do. If we are contributing to a knowledge base, understanding why and how weight stigma is associated with poor mental and physical health, we shouldn't be perpetuating the very stigma in our articles.
Yes, so well said. And that's, I think, such an important thing for everyone to hear, but especially fellow researchers. Like, I really, really hope that the upcoming generation of researchers can really change this and make it so that articles about weight stigma don't have to be, I don't have to be saying like, hey, trigger warning to my clients and listeners who want to look at this research because it's super problematic and still has a bunch of the same diet culture-y messages that we're trying to avoid. But it has a good point about weight stigma. Like, I would love to have the literature be something that I can like unabashedly recommend to anyone.
Yeah, and I think that we should, and I have the same sort of hope for the literature as you do. I would love for us to get to that point. And like I said, I was not always like this. I want, listeners to go and look at my old writings and see. You can see the transition, and you can see the point at which I began to take a critical lens, fat studies and critical feminist lens to the work that I do, and at least to the framing that I do. This transition for me was in large part due to reading a chapter by Tracy Tilka, Janelle Mensinger, and Rachel Calogero that basically called out all of us weight stigma researchers for perpetuating weight stigma in our articles. And it was so incredibly eye-opening. And from that day forward, from reading that paper forward, the framing of my manuscripts changed. And I wish everybody could read that chapter. And I really think that it's important because it will help other researchers to think a little more critically and to sort of break free of the medical model that more often than not we're framed in.
Yes. And I think too, having people like medical doctors and dietitians and folks who are on the ground working with people and trying to use an evidence base for our work, if we can start looking at I want to link to that chapter in the show notes, even if we can't link to the full text, at least we can link to where it is available online so people can download it or buy it or whatever. Because I think that if the people who are doing the work in the medical field based on this evidence can understand that it's not enough to just be kinder and gentler with our weight management recommendations. It's not enough to say oh, I don't want to stigmatize you because I know stigma is bad because the literature says so. So I'm going to deliver my weight management advice with a really kind approach, that's not enough. That's not enough. And it's still stigmatizing to even offer quote unquote weight management. It's still weight stigma. It's still fat phobia to tell someone that they need to shrink their body.
Exactly. And I mean, to draw maybe perhaps a somewhat of an extreme example, but a parallel to that is trying to find a non-stigmatizing approach to gay reparative therapy.
Yes.
It's the exact same idea. It's trying to make me not gay, but doing it in a non-stigmatizing way because we know how much, anti-gay stigma is bad for your health.
Right.
But it's inherently the same framework. It's the same queerphobic, homophobic framework, but trying to do it in a happy, stigma-free frame. And it doesn't work. In the weight domain, it is perpetuating fat phobia. It is continuing to reify sort of the social structure that says that thin bodies are better than fatter bodies. It's doing as much harm as it is good. In that article, as much as you're, working to understand how stigma is an impediment to health, you're contributing to that stigma by perpetuating this frame.
Yeah. Yeah. By saying, quote unquote, obesity is bad, that is inherently fat phobic. And we know that from the research too, right? I love Abigail Sogi's and colleagues' work at UCLA looking at how exposing people to the quote unquote obesity epidemic rhetoric and ideas that being fat is bad for your health, how doing that in an experimental setting actually causes increased levels of weight stigma. They've measured this. And I think we need so much more research like that just to make that connection crystal clear to anyone who is still has questions about it or still sort of has one foot in diet culture and is trying to come out into the anti-weight stigma place, but is still holding on to weight management a little bit. I think that research and the chapter that you mentioned too are such powerful evidence bases against using weight management at all.
100% agree. I love Abigail and David. David Frederick is one of her colleagues on that paper. They actually have a couple papers that are looking at that very topic of thinking about how we frame weight, and the quote unquote obesity epidemic has important implications for weight stigma. And so it's important not only for, like you say, for researchers, but it's important for policymakers. I would love it if policymakers, health campaign and health policymakers could read Abby's work and see just how vastly important the frames, these public health frames that we use, are for shaping people's responses to them and for, perpetuating the stigma associated with higher body weight.
Yeah, because it really is the framing of it, right? It's looking at, you can look at anything through such different lenses. You can frame anything in different ways, and the way that we frame things matters. And just as you made that analogy with gay reparative therapy or whatever, it's thank God that has now been thoroughly debunked in most corners of the world. And of course, there's still some corners that are holding on and that are doing it. And it's really toxic and horrible and discriminatory. But for the most part, I think the scientific community at least recognizes it's not possible to make someone who's gay not gay, or to make someone who isn't gay for that matter, that it's not a choice. But that I think we need that same sort of scientific certainty, just to have it on lock that we all know in this community that weight stigma is not okay, and that making larger bodies smaller is not something you can actually do in the long term, and that it has really severe negative consequences on people's mental and physical health. And so let's stop doing it and let's start treating people with dignity and respect that they deserve.
Exactly. Dignity and respect are not predicated on having a certain body type. They are not contingent upon being a certain dress size, or they're not contingent on being healthy. everyone is deserving of respect and is deserving of dignity, regardless of their weight, regardless of their health, regardless of any characteristic. People deserve respect and dignity, full stop.
Yes. I don't know why that's so hard for people to understand, for certain communities to understand at least.
I think one of the issues too is that the issues of weight and self-control become incredibly moralized. And so people feel rightful in stigmatizing and shaming higher body weight individuals because they think it's a personal failure and that they're just not, they're weak-willed, and so that they deserve that treatment. And, that's one of the things that diet culture does, is it perpetuates these negative stereotypes. That the only reason people are higher body weight is because they lack the necessary self-control to be in a thinner body, which we both know is bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse my
oh no, feel free.
Potty mouth.
We're all about the potty mouth here.
Okay, good. But that's one of the insidious nature, or one of the many insidious aspects of diet culture, is it convinces society writ large that higher body weight individuals lack the necessary self-control to be thin, and it convinces thin people that the reason they are thin is because they have self-control. So it almost works to perpetuate that stereotype in both directions. For higher body weight individuals, they come to internalize that they just don't have enough self-control or willpower to maintain a quote-unquote healthy body weight. And for thinner individuals who are probably naturally that way, it convinces them or reminds them that, it must be something about them and their moral courage or their strength that allows them to stay thinner. And that's what makes it particularly challenging to face. And that's why it's particularly important for us to be tackling it in a variety of ways. Tackling weight stigma as it exists in the academic literature, tackling weight stigma as it exists in discrimination laws and larger social structures, tackling ideas as simple as representation. I saw on Twitter that you've been watching Shrill.
Oh, yes.
And I'm all equally as obsessed with that show.
So good.
But we could have an entire conversation just about that show, probably.
I know, we could.
And issues of representation that can be used to debunk stereotypes. If we show fat characters in nuanced ways like we show thinner characters, we get to learn that they're not just always obsessed with their weight, that they're not always unhappy, that you can be fat and happy, and that those things are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sort of helps take away that moral stigma too, because you see people in their full humanity. You see them being loving daughters and partners and friends and having a full life and having, just being the rich tapestry that all of us human beings are, which gets so cut off and narrowed when we see traditional representations of fat people in diet culture, which is just, unhappy or weak or lazy or whatever the stereotypes are that are applied to them. And there's no alternative representation. And so, of course, people can very much internalize the idea that those stereotypes must be true. There must be something wrong with me. The natural way the body should be is not what my body is. And therefore, there's something terribly wrong with me, or I'm unnatural, I'm bad, I'm doing it wrong. And that's just not true. And being able to show people having such different experiences and larger bodied folks like doing everything that everyone else does, I think really does help tear down those stereotypes.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I'm glad to see that we're getting more nuanced and more richly textured fat characters, with Shrill, with Melissa McCarthy's latest movie. We're starting to see stronger character development. It would be nice to also have, diverse fat characters, but that's obviously another issue is, representation across race and sexual orientation, but it's good to see at least some representation on the weight front.
Totally. I think representation of other identities has been sort of in the media and talked about, at least given lip service to, for probably a little longer than representation of larger bodies. And so I think it's nice to see that folks in larger bodies are getting more representation on mainstream media now too. But it's still such a small drop in the bucket. It really does need to be, it's again, sort of like a society-wide thing. Like you said, that's why I think the concept of diet culture is so helpful because culture is not just one thing. It's not just talking about the diet industry or the media or the medical field or how parents talk to their kids or how like random TV shows portray size. It's all of it. Diet culture is all of those things, and all of those things work together and inform each other because culture really is just people. It's like people with our points of view that are, we come up steeped in diet culture. And like you said, you had that transition out of it. Like as a researcher, you were just sort of uncritically publishing what you saw other people publishing, the types of messages about body size, and just continuing to perpetuate that. As a dietitian, I was like continuing to perpetuate it at the beginning of my career, came out of traditional dietetics education and worked in quote unquote weight management and told people that they should be eating more of this and less of that, and that it was their responsibility to change their body size. And it wasn't until I had some kind of wake up calls like you did of reading different things or interacting with particular people or going to conferences that blew my mind and realizing I needed to do better and doing better. And I think that happens like at a cultural level. That happens, it's individuals, but it's also changing the culture. Like the fact that you had that awakening and are now publishing a different type of work, and that you're reading other people's work, and you're sharing with me off mic that like you will now recommend that other people whose work you're reading reframe things and take out the stigmatizing language, that has ripple effects throughout the whole culture. The fact that I came to Health at Every Size and intuitive eating and stopped doing weight management and now do this podcast that people listen to around the world, like that has ripple effects in the culture. I think everyone with any sort of position in any field really can have ripple effects in the culture based on their own transition to anti-diet culture.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think if we can each take our corner of the culture, taking my area of research and knowing that I've been in the weight stigma literature long enough to be able to use my voice and use my position and advocate on behalf of higher body weight individuals, on behalf of an explicitly anti-stigma approach, and one that doesn't perpetuate this negative obesity management stigmatizing frame, the better. We can lead other people to this because we can say, look, I was not perfect. None of us are perfect. Not many of us have come at this correct from the beginning. But that doesn't mean we need to perpetuate the inaccuracies and the stigmatizing perspectives that we've been used to doing. If we can reflect critically on our practice, reflect critically on our research, reflect critically on our publications and our dissemination, we can work to undermine this diet culture, which I think is really, just this front for this system that privileges, prioritizes, and glorifies thinner bodies over fatter ones. If we can work to basically smash that hierarchy that says that thinner bodies are better than fatter bodies, and that's how it's going to be, that's how it's got to be. If we take that uncritically, we're just going to perpetuate it. But if we attack it from a critical perspective and delegitimize that structure and delegitimize that hierarchy, we can eventually topple it.
Absolutely. And going back to what you were saying about weight stigma research, like how just sort of antithetical it is to the weight stigma research to then turn around and say, and like, let's do this so that we can shrink people's bodies. It's so clear when you talk about that hierarchy of bodies, which really does underlie diet culture, that hierarchy itself is weight stigma. Like diet culture is weight stigma. And so if we want to eradicate weight stigma with all, and we haven't even gotten into what your research has found around the physical and mental health effects of weight stigma, which are profound. And, we've talked about it a lot on the podcast too. Like weight stigma has independent health effects, independent of people's actual body size. And so if we want to actually help people's health and well-being and help them be happier and more fulfilled and, psychologically and mentally better off, then we have to topple this hierarchy because the hierarchy itself is stigmatizing.
Mm-hmm. The hierarchy is, structural weight stigma. It is a structure that privileges thinner bodies over fatter ones, and that says there is one and only one ideal body type. And that is what diet culture is predicated on. If there were more than one acceptable body type, diet culture wouldn't be trying to force everyone into that same one. And it's really trying to get everybody to this false place of an ideal body type. And that ideal body type is a thinner one, in society's eyes. And by thinking critically about how these sort of structural processes underlie a lot of the things that we talk about with respect to interpersonal weight stigma, when we talk about diet culture, and, when we talk about all these different levels, it has to all come back to this idea that we are operating in this system that is designed to privilege one body type over another. And if we can't, we need to successfully, basically, like I said, topple that hierarchy. Otherwise, it's going to be really challenging to change anything that happens underneath it.
That's so true, because then you end up in that wellness place again, or that whatever comes next, whatever the new iteration of diet culture is, that's still based on the hierarchy, that's still saying like, P.S. you'll lose weight, the sort of whispered, like winking thing of like, it's about your health, but no, it's actually about your weight. And having it be so underground, I think, to get to a place where it's truly beyond diet culture's clutches, we have to really truly stop thinking and believing that any body size is better than the rest.
Yeah. And I think it's about saying unequivocally, any and all bodies are good. Any and all bodies deserve respect, deserve dignity, even if you're unhealthy. I think that is one issue that health at every size can often miss, or can come at it uncritically, is to also say, yes, we as an approach, Hayes would like to advocate on behalf of health. But just because you're unhealthy does not mean that you are unworthy or not to be respected or not to be shown dignity. And the health at every size perspective has to be a little more critical about that, to make sure that they're not diving too far into the health frame where people who are unhealthy just feel like they're now the new marginalized or stigmatized group.
Yeah, totally. I know health at every size has gone through its own evolution with that, because it was sort of in that healthist territory, or at least left itself open to healthist interpretations until I think it was like 2013 or something. They revised the principles, ASDA revised the principles of Hayes to explicitly, or maybe even more recently actually, but to explicitly say like health is not an obligation. Everybody has value and is deserving of respect, even if you're not actively pursuing health or quote unquote healthy. And like, also, what does that even mean? Like, health is not a state that you just achieve and stay there. It's like a more of a practice or a resource that you can tap into if and when you desire, if and when you have the resources available to yourself to even go there. It's not a moral obligation. That it's not saying health at every size is not saying like it's okay to be fat as long as you're healthy, which is the interpretation that I hear a lot of people say when they're just dipping a toe into health at every size and like don't quite get it yet. That's like where they stop. Absolutely.
And I think that, I don't know what year it is. It might be around the same time that ASDA made the changes, but Linda and Lucy published Body Respect, which is sort of a follow-up to the earlier Health at Every Size book that is coming at it from a much more critical lens, like a critical studies perspective, and making sure that any healthist notions are shot down and it's explicitly anti-healthist, which I think is an important improvement.
Very important.
I highly recommend that book. I really enjoy it.
Same here. And I think also Linda has said they don't ascribe to or recommend the original Health at Every Size book anymore, because this Body Respect is sort of updating it and bringing it into a more critical framework, thanks to Lucy Aphramore, who I think had brought a lot of that social justice perspective, and that they collaborated on that and advanced the Health at Every Size message beyond what it was originally.
Yeah, and I think that Lucy brings sort of a really critical social justice studies lens to it. And she gave a keynote at our International Weight Stigma Conference last year, and it was just brilliant. It was probably one of the best keynotes we've had in years. And so I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to hear her speak, but she is an incredible speaker.
She is incredible. She was on the podcast actually a couple years ago, like maybe a year and a half ago, I think. We can link to that in the show notes for this episode too. But yeah, she was incredible. I heard her speak at an eating disorders conference, and I think it was primarily poetry. She did some poetry and then some presentation, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was just enough to sort of like whet my appetite and be like, this person is fascinating. I want to know more about her work, and like really dove into it and had a great conversation with her on the show. And like, I really think it's kind of incredible to have a dietitian be so vocally outspoken about social justice, because that's not, just traditionally dietetics backgrounds are so far from being open to and considering social justice. And I think like having someone who's such a radical dietitian really leading the way in my profession is just so inspiring and feels good.
She adopted that same approach as our keynote, where it was part prose and part presentation. And I was left just speechless. It was so unique, but so incredibly powerful and insightful. I think I took a picture of every single one of her slides.
Yeah.
Only to find out at the end of the talk that she was going to post them for us. But at least I have them saved as pictures in my phone.
Right. Little mementos when you need them.
Yeah. She was fantastic. So
yeah, that's amazing. And just so cool that the International Weight Stigma Conference exists. I'm actually going to be sponsoring it this year, one of the sponsors. And just like the fact that that's something that happens is so cool to me, because 10, 15 years ago, that probably wasn't happening.
yeah, it's such a fantastic conference. I've been helping out Angela Meadows on the steering committee for maybe the past 4 or 5 years now. And it just brings together such a diverse set of stakeholders, from researchers like myself. I'd say I'm probably in the minority as a psychologist there, to be honest. A lot of dietetics researchers and practitioners, health at every size advocates, fat activists, and we try each year to get some sort of buy-in from government officials or some sort of legislative or legal angle as well, so that we're bringing together 60 to 70 delegates for these 2 days to really have these cross-disciplinary, deep conversations about all of the ways in which weight stigma is operating, and how we can go about collectively to basically act to stop it, and to stop its implications for, in the legal profession, its implications for health practice, for, nutrition practice, for health and well-being of higher body weight individuals. I love it.
That's so cool. And it's like those ripple effects we were talking about, it's different domains of life that all have effects on people's relationships with their bodies and people's ability to move freely through the world. So yeah, how cool and how necessary that it's really addressing it from all those different angles.
And I think that's one of the really unique aspects about the International Weight Stigma Conferences is that interdisciplinarity. Like, oftentimes you will find a bunch of people that are siloed in their own discipline. Me talking to a bunch of other psychologists, or nutritionists just talking to nutritionists, and epidemiologists just to epi folks. And these are issues that cross levels, that cross disciplines, and that cross sectors. And if we aren't crossing all of those ways, we're not going to be fully equipped to deal with and eradicate weight stigma.
So true. Oh my God, Jeff, I could talk to you forever. This is so much fun and so long in the coming. I'm so glad we finally made it happen.
I am so glad that I was finally able to come on. I apologize about having to reschedule a few times.
Oh,
but
no,
it was
it's okay.
Such a fantastic conversation. I loved it.
So worth it. So worth the wait. I loved it too. Tell us where people can find more about you and your work and learn about all the cool stuff you're doing.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to hear more about my work and to keep up with where I'm presenting or what I'm publishing is jeffreyhunger.com. It's JEFFREYHUNGER. Or you can follow me on Twitter, which is @drhunger. So @Dr. Hunger.
Amazing. Also, what a cool name to have in this field.
I will say I have lucked out with the last name for helping with recognition. They'll be like, Hunger, aren't you that weight stigma guy?
Yep.
Yeah. So
it's really helpful.
It's perfect.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much again for coming on. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Jeffrey Hunger for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message, because who doesn't, by sharing this episode on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. Sharing on one of the Apple platforms helps bring us up in the podcast rankings so that more people discover us, and so that we can continue to drown out those pro-diet messages in the health category. And be sure to subscribe to the show if you haven't already. You can do that by going to christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path for yourself, you can grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/192. That's christyharrison.com/192. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, break free from diet culture, and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. A big thanks to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.